Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the Expat Files. I have a special guest today, good friend, really fine, all around fine fellow. My buddy Ivor Cummins has agreed to join us. He has something really awesome to share. I thought we're here in Buenos Aires. This is the second time this year Ivor and I have met up, and every time I talk to the guy, I learn something new. And I spent 17 years in medicine, and what Ivor was teaching me was new to me also. And I fancied myself something of a pro on these kinds of preventative topics. I won't give away what we're going to discuss because I think it's important enough that I asked him to just sit down and share his expertise on what may be the most important test in all of biomedicine for aging, healthy aging, and for, I think, tens of millions of people who probably don't know that they're kind of have walking time bomb going on inside them. So with that as an introduction, welcome, Ivor. Super happy to see you. We had a good time this week. Really smart people running around and getting to hear from people from all over the world. But your talk on health, your talk on monitoring blood glucose and insulin, and your incredible story about meeting a gentleman named Joseph Kraft, Dr. Joseph Kraft. Please share with folks the importance of this test, like set this up, tee this up for people about why this particular topic is so important for people's health going forward.
Yeah, great stuff, Tan. Well, yeah, there's so many blood tests, and I specialize in all of them over the years, in my research. But this one is just kind of Pareto principle, 80-20. This is the big one. It covers a lot of the ground. So basically what it is you drink a glucose drink, 75 grams, and then over the next couple of hours, you measure your insulin response. So the OGTT, or the oral glucose tolerance test, is pretty good, and it's establishment, and they measure your glucose response. But far more powerful is to see what your insulin's doing. So,
and explain the difference between these two, because people know of diabetics do a finger prick test, and talk about the delusion of A1C, because this was fascinating to me. I know a lot of people track certain numbers about blood glucose levels, but you're saying, based on your understanding and your discussion with, and maybe you'll even go back if you can and talk about how you interviewed Dr. Kraft and what he discovered. Maybe give some people some background on this.
Yeah, actually, by telling Joe's story, it's a good way to cover that. So Dr. Kraft was a medical captain in World War II stationed in Panama. So this is how far back. So people might wonder, how did you interview him a few years ago? Well, I interviewed him when he was 93 years old. So I discovered there was this guy who had done a massive amount of insulin testing, full 5-hour insulin assays. Now that's a big deal because the patient drinks the glucose and they're there for 6 hours, sedentary. It's research level stuff. But he got access to Pharmacia's first insulin testing equipment in the 70s. They donated it to promote the test. Big machine nowadays, it's easy. And he began to test. He was a pathologist and he was fascinated by diabetic dysfunction. And he began to measure insulin on all these people. 15,000 he did in the end. And the key thing was, after the first 1,000 or so were done, and he had all the graphs, he's a real data guy, he laid them out on his apartment floor. Fascinating story, because he had sensed there was a repeat in the patterns. So rather than everyone just having a different pattern, he noticed, and he laid them out, there were 5 distinct patterns. So it was digital, which is very interesting to an engineer or pathologist. So long story short, he split them out into the patterns and then started testing more people, and it never changed. And what he discovered was, even though these were people who were not type 2 diabetic, they had various issues, but their glucose was okay, their A1C was okay. He was finding that most of them, regardless, were pattern 2, 3, or 4 hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, which is type 2 diabetes. So he was discovering diabetes type 2 was vastly bigger than anyone thought. And he published in 75 the first laboratory diagnosis, or earliest, for diabetes using insulin. And his statistician, I think a Dr. C, he told me, an Asian guy, math guy, he went through the 15,000 and he said pretty much, you don't need to measure half hour, 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour, 5 hour. Overwhelmingly, the 2-hour insulin, if it's below 30 units after the glucose, you're good. And if it's above 40 microunits per mil, you're bad, you're diabetic. So that's the hack for people listening. You just drink the 75-gram glucose, you get a single insulin test, And that value, if it's below 30, you're kosher. And that's probably the simplest and best test for longevity and health.
Would you just tell people, like, what did you do that made you an expert on this? Because you were never in medicine to begin with. This is something that you kind of picked up on the side, but you had a big problem solving brain because of your time as an engineer. Can you talk to people about what happened in 2020 that really sort of pushed you to the fore?
Oh yeah, well, very briefly. So it was 2012. I was a biochemical engineer, graduated in 1990, so I'd done all the chemistry of life and metabolic stuff, but mostly for the next 30 years I worked in corporate, did 5 years in medical device and all fine, but then I spent 20 years in high volume consumer products, so I didn't really stay in the medical. But in 2012 I got some standard blood tests, after a bike crash, generic tests, nothing special, and 3 of the measures were way out of whack. The cholesterol was way high, the liver enzyme, gamma glutamate ferritin. I won't get into detail, but they were so high, I knew as an engineer, I'm way outside the normal distribution, and I quizzed the doctor on okay, what does this mean for implications for health and root causes? Because that's my job, I'm a complex problem solver. I run teams in corporate and things more complex than this, to be honest. So I grilled immediately, and it was clear to me the doctor was not really sure of the answers. So I thought it was weird, because when I go to content experts and I'm called in to take over the team because there's a big problem and it's not getting resolved, I go to the content experts and I quiz them, and they answer because they know their own tests. She didn't.
One would hope.
Yeah, went to another doctor, connected through a friend, senior doctor, really smart guy, similar, and then I went to a professor of medicine I mentioned earlier, and clearly, had some thoughts, but I just knew they don't know. So I spent a few weeks then obsessively in ResearchGate, PubMed, straight to the published literature. I had corporate log-on access, and I followed up the metrics, and then I followed up on all the mechanisms, and I just followed the problem-solving structured process. And within a week or two, I was finding out cholesterol was nonsense. Mm-hmm. Fat being bad was nonsense. I was discovering insulin resistance. I was discovering metabolic syndrome. Wow. And the more I saw, the more shocked I was. And a few weeks later, I just switched to meat, fish, and eggs and nothing else, and started skipping meals. I lost 35 pounds, or 15 kilos, in 9 weeks. Mm. I went back and got blood tests, and my bloods were exquisite. Mm. So basically, it was cracked. Yeah. And then I began to lecture to rooms of 100 engineers and managers in my corporate, and then I put some on YouTube, and then blah. Boom. So 2012-13, and with all that for 10 years, 2020, when that crap started, not being smart, but I knew straight away it was nonsense.
Right. That's incredible. So to give people context here, understand what diabetes, what elevated blood glucose, what insulin resistance is actually doing to the body, right? Dr. Kraft said, I heard you say last night when we were discussing this, all heart disease is ultimately diabetes, right? That an enormous amount of circulatory and then obviously cardio kinds of pathologies are exactly your small blood vessels breaking down, because once you have this elevated glucose from insulin resistance, that you're in deep trouble. Ultimately, what that does, the simple mechanical metaphor or parallel would be sugar in a gas tank, right? Obviously, that gums up the smaller and smaller areas where the gas has to be vaporized before it gets injected into the engine to be combusted. This cannot happen. And you have blood vessels in your body that are 1 blood cell wide. So you can imagine if you have this gummy substance, right, that gets into your circulatory system, and unlike a car, which you could wash out, right, with some kind of solvent, you can't recover, right? These small blood vessels really do go down. Now, you said something interesting. The smallest blood vessels are in your fingers and your toes, obviously, right? The extremities, your kidneys and your eyes. And so he talked about eyesight, rapid onset loss of night vision, right? Eyesight in general, right? Is a big warning marker. But you said something really interesting about the area of conduction of electricity in the heart, and how these tiny vesicles, when you see people with this insulin resistance kind of pattern, he was saying that this is the link to heart attack, to heart disease that is so commonly overlooked. And let's also tell them about, why he had to do battle with the medical system. Talk about that.
Oh yeah, well, we'll get to his battles. As he said, we were swimming upstream. He had lovely phrases for everything, very educated. He also said, HbA1c is no good because half of his people, the A1C was fine, but they were diabetic from the insulin test. And his words were, A1C failed its component in that regard. I mean, what a way of saying things.
A true academic.
Beautiful, beautiful man. But back to the eyes. So we know that you can look to the back of the retina with a scope and you can see diabetics before they're diagnosed. And it's because the little vessels are getting vasculitis, being damaged, and you can see them. So he was well aware of that. The other thing, though, he was fascinated by the pathologist Kimmelstein. And Kimmelstein, in crass words, had a love affair with the kidney. He was obsessed with the kidney, dynamics. And what Kimmelstein discovered was, indeed, that there was vasculitis in the kidney before blood sugars were elevated, but when insulin was elevated. Mm-hmm. So yes, the sugar, there's glucotoxicity and the sugar destroys your arteries, absolutely. But there's also insulin toxicity, which is actually starting earlier.
So insulin can be elevated before you start seeing signs of elevated blood glucose. That's Absolutely. Really the significance of the test.
That is the kernel. Yeah, up to 10 years before. So obviously, if you're beginning to destroy your arteries, and the point you mentioned about the heart, yes, Kraft was a pathologist. He'd done thousands of autopsies. And he connected sudden cardiac death, SCD. So we have the classic blockages, but you also have sudden cardiac death with maybe not so much blockages of the pipes. So in the center of the heart is the IV septum, the interventricular septum, and in there is a load of tiny vessels. And like I said, that's the timing kind of pacemaker for your heart. It's quite fascinating. But he narrowed down to heart attacks where the vessels in the IV septum that run the microprocessor, they've got vasculitis and then something goes wrong and the heart stops. Exactly. So he said many heart attacks are actually very likely this mechanism, including, ironically, 9 children. His own son died 30 years before he did. Wow. And he didn't do the autopsy, naturally, it wouldn't be right, but a good friend of his did. And again, the damage was in the IV septum, clearly.
And what did he say, or what did his research show? Did you get into this, and have you looked into, what do you do about vasculitis? One of the things that's obviously on people's minds is a lot of people took an injection that was of questionable usage. And a lot of the problems that came up during the COVID fiasco, let's call it, had exactly to do with, I had a friend in Guatemala too, he was diabetic.
Endothelium,
yeah. Excuse me, the endotheliitis, inflammation inside the blood vessels, essentially causing kidney failure, right? In his case, what can people do for this? I mean, have you looked into also solutions for people dealing with vasculitis of the tiny vesicles?
Well, yeah, so there's two classes of response broadly, I'd say, Jane. The first one we focus on is the hyperinsulinemia and collapsing that ASAP. And that's quite easy. So if you think 80-20, 80% of our problems with all of these issues, and even with that medication, and even with the C19 thing itself, if you put yourself in the position of a very high metabolic health, which means very high immune, balance, etc., have a problem. You won't have a problem. So if you do have a problem, the simplest possible thing is you switch to an ancestral human diet. It's simple: meat, fish, and eggs primarily, and low-starch vegetables. And any high insulin problems will collapse. Within 1 day, your insulin's going to be falling fast. Within 1 day, your insulin's going to be falling fast. That's a quick list. Within a few weeks, you can put type 2 diabetes into full clinical remission. Now you can't cure it because a lifetime got you there, and you can put it in full remission and maintain it. But if you go back to pizzas and stuff, you maintain for those people. But yeah, you maintain an ancestral human diet, and that's going to have a massive beneficial effect. And the body is quite good at self-healing. Now, for the win or for serious cases of diabetes where it's entrenched and they've lost pancreatic function, you can then talk about going further, and doing long periods of fast. We've had type 2 diabetics that did the right diet, their insulin collapsed nicely, but they still failed Kraft's test.
the
and
breakthrough for
literally
them was
draining
to
out
go
the remaining
hardcore
visceral fat from the
fasting
organs and
and
forcing the
literally
system,
draining
and then
out the
finally
remaining visceral
passing
fat
the
from the
test.
organs
So
and
you go
forcing the
further,
system, and
if you
then
have the big
finally
C,
passing the
again,
test.
I
So
personally,
you
and I
go
don't give medical
further, and
advice,
I think
especially
if
if
you
that's
have the big
controversial.
C,
I can say though
again, I
personally, if I
personally, I
got
don't
a
give
cancer
medical
bug,
advice, especially if that's
no question I'd
controversial.
be doing
I can say though
paleo
personally, if
protocol
I
from
got a
Hungary.
cancer problem,
I visited with
no
them,
question,
and
I'd
they
be
do
doing
pretty much only
paleomedicina
meats and organ
protocol
meats
from
and remove
Hungary.
all plant
I
proteins
visited with
for
them,
a period.
and they do pretty much
And
only meats and
they've had
organ meats and
astonishing
remove all
results. It
plant
sounds
proteins
extreme, but
for a
We'll have to put a
period.
link to the
And they've had
yeah,
astonishing results.
paleomedicina,
It
it's
sounds
.com.
extreme, but
We'll have to put a link to the below the video here.
yeah, paleomedicina, I think .com, but yeah, amazing.
Excellent, excellent. So, unlike a car, right, your body does regenerate is the other good piece of news here, which is, if you have a systemic inflammatory problem and vasculitis and tiny blood vessels causing these kinds of problems, obviously the first thing you want to do, if you're even think that you're dealing with a problem with this, and is this a test, a test that should be like if you're over 40, you definitely want to check for this, or at what age should people be screening for elevated insulin in the blood?
Well,
my record is I had a guy from New York, 27 years old, wrote to me and he wanted to get a coronary calcium scan, CT scan of the heart. It's not blood calcium. It sees the calcium in your arteries from all of this problem. Your body uses calcium to shore up or strengthen arteries to avoid them popping, a pustule. And this guy gave me his bloods and I said, look, yeah, you're diabetic. He was 27, I think his father died at 38 of a heart attack. So he was worried, he knew he'd had a bad history, smoking, eating junk food. And they didn't want to give him a scan because he was too young. He finally got through and got a scan at 600. So that's the arteries kind of an 80-year-old.
Right.
Full of calcium. So there's an example of, and he of course the Kraft test would have been blown away by him, because even his glucose was up at 6 millimole, like his liver enzymes, he was screaming diabetic, but he technically still wasn't diabetic by the standards.
So let's talk about this because again, Dr. Kraft, I had my own phase and I sort of alluded to some part of my own journey being crucified by the modern medical system that is so resistant to anything that, again, I don't think it's a mystery at this point that there's such a strong profit motive built in the medical system. I don't want to shock anybody. It's not run by doctors, right? It is run by people looking at spreadsheets of profit and loss and accountants and administrators and like, how are we going to increase efficiency and get more revenue, et cetera, et cetera. And so, healing is well down on the list of priorities if it makes it at all in some cases. And we assume that it does. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. But talk about, you had a chance to talk with Dr. Kraft. You had a chance to actually hear this guy's story and do some research on it while he was still alive. What was he up against? What did he say about his own journey? Because, here's a guy, his first published paper was 1975, but he really didn't make much of a dent, right? Even though this knowledge is known, even though you can find out about his work, if you're willing to do a little bit of research, or, you come across a podcast like this and have a reason to go look at something like this, you can do yourself a world of good, but you're not going to get this information from your physician. You're not going to find this from your doctor, not even in a preventative checkup, right? For something, are they going to talk to you about elevated insulin and the importance of the 2-hour insulin test? So tell about his story a little bit, because I think it's so representative of what we're up against.
Well, you know what I'll do, Jen, I'll preface it with that point. So we in the family have a teaching professor of medicine, multiply published, super smart guy. And when I discovered this many years ago and I was running it by him, he was saying, but insulin? And he only knew insulin really as a medication for type 1 diabetes. He had no concept of insulin as an indicator of metabolic health at all. That shows you.
That shows you the medical school training.
It's insane. And it's the same now. I have other family members just gone through medical school. They briefly mentioned insulin, but not in the way that we would. So Kraft went and he thought, wow, this is huge. Occult diabetes in situ, he called it. And he went to the pathology mega conferences. There was a lot of interest at first. The pathologists were fascinated. He thought, great. And then he began to try and bring it to the diabetes charities and the diabetes organizations. And then he said, We were swimming upstream.
And much to his shock and chagrin,
They wouldn't touch it. He said basically they came back very cold to him after a presentation, and then they shut him out. Because for them, diabetes is the disease of blood glucose.
And why is it a disease of blood glucose, Ivor? Because
Well, on one hand, non-corrupt reason is it's just simply the way they were. They didn't know about insulin, and they said high insulin. But no, insulin problems in diabetes is type 1, where your pancreas is gone. It's low insulin. What do you mean high insulin? And they didn't like it because it was against everything they actually believed.
they were already bought into a model that said something different, and then that model was making pretty good scratch.
As word got around, they saw it was a threat to their whole paradigm. And their whole treatment and funding and everything was threatened. And I think they also, because Kraft didn't get into the diet stuff, but he would have let them know that, and he did this with patients, published on it, frank diabetes, huge insulin, over 6 months with a low carbohydrate management. They were down to euinsulinemia, non-diabetic.
They knew
the food industry and everything and funders realized, we start focusing on insulin, and the answer is a low carb diet, which we've already told people will give you a heart attack. This is a mess. And so you add a lot of those factors together.
We were here, we heard from a lot of guys in finance. We talk about investing, we talk about what's happening, how to protect your money through the kind of turbulence that we see ahead, or that's already happening. We're already in it, obviously. And I think anybody who's educated on the topic of money also at some point comes to, you come to study and understand the Federal Reserve, central banking, fiat currency. I mean, there is a level within our institutions now, and perhaps society has always been this way. I won't even say perhaps. I mean, institutions are set up to benefit certain people. In the best case, they do serve the common good, but genuinely the common good, like it helps regular folks sort of get by and raise children, et cetera, et cetera. But the parallel, where I'm going with this, and the parallel is when you study the monetary system, when you study fiat central banking, you do come to an understanding that, wait a second, like this can't go on. Like it can't work like this. And my parallel here, and the point that I'm trying to make, is the medical system also has been set up in a way, the disincentives to helping patients, the disincentives built into the system. Here we are talking about the diabetes industry and the importance of selling, all the different drugs that they can sell you, from metformin on down, which do help certain people, and they do have their place, but they're not looking for an answer to these conditions. They're looking to continue to sell you treatments and pills and doctor visits and et cetera, et cetera. And so there's an incredible gradient toward, hey, if we can just string people along, we'll continue to profit and to benefit. And it's no different in finance, and it's no different in medicine. And so, I spent time treating people for gastric problems, digestive issues, chronic digestive issues, and the acid reflux pill industry is no different, right? The idea that you're going to block your stomach acid and that somehow that's a good solution to something like acid reflux. Your daughter's getting married tomorrow and you get a bout of acid reflux and you need to get a good night's sleep, take an acid blocker. But putting people on acid blockers for 10, 20 years, like this kind of approach, it's at this point, knowing what we know about medicine, and I think this applies too to the story of Dr. Kraft and to what you're saying, it is a form of malpractice. There's no question about it. The fact that doctors are trained the way they're trained and that they all agree that it can't be true. We just lived through one of the most extraordinary periods where, there was almost nothing that the people in charge weren't lying about in the last 4 years. It's very hard to find a mainstream source that wasn't full of shit right from 2020 onward. And so I feel like there's an interesting little thing in the air right now, and the election is over as we're recording this. Are we going to see sort of new dawn on some of these topics? And then medicine, I don't know. Do you have a sense? Do you have a feel for where this could go? And
yeah, with RFK and all, and Musk coming in.
Well, also just with the era of this kind of independent media, where guys like you and me can sit down and spread the word and like, listen, it's very simple. you may be at risk for this. Go get a 2-hour insulin test and find out if you already have damage to your small and vasculitis going on, because you can really reverse this thing very, very simply just by knowing about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, the reversibility is astonishing.
We have thousands, just in my network alone, of astonishing stories of weight loss and reversal, or not reversal, but remission diabetes. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. But you know what? I know you're tight for time, but I got one last anecdote on that topic generally. So the coronary calcium scan I mentioned, and I have many talks, and I can give you a link to my talks on calcium scan. It's so important. Briefly, that 5-minute scan, $100 in the US, it will tell you your risk of a heart attack in the next 10 years and your mortality risk. Way better than all of the current algorithms and blood tests and predictors together. So it's astonishing. So astonishing. But the medical business for 40 years hate it, and there's a few reasons. One reason is if people start getting lots of calcium scans, you'll begin to realize that low cholesterol with massive heart disease and super high cholesterol with no heart disease is everywhere.
Yeah.
So cholesterol's nonsense.
Yeah.
So they don't want
the cholesterol argument is nonsense. It's been nonsense for many, many years. And
absurd.
Yeah.
But the real, there's many more reasons they don't like it. But one, I'll tell you, from a movie made by a guy who was funding me. He was trying to save the world from heart disease. Wealthy guy, put $2 million in the movie. And I can give you the link to that. It's called The Widowmaker. I put it on YouTube years ago. But the Mayo Clinic, I think it was, and this is in the movie, so this is proven, there's no libel. The Mayo Clinic, when the calcium scan came out, super quick, apparently amazing, a technical team went to investigate it. And they came back excited after a short while, and they said, wow, around half the people or more that we send into the cath lab for an invasive angiogram, half of them have a 0 calcium in the super quick non-invasive test, and that means we could actually not need to go in
to go inside
with half of them.
Yeah.
And the management looked at this and they shut it down.
Yeah, of course they did.
A third of their revenue was coming from the cath lab, and they would have halved a third of the revenue, and they just looked and said no way.
Yeah.
And that's on the record. They shut it down.
Yeah.
So that's the tip of the iceberg.
There's so much stuff like this in the medical world. I got a chance to work in several hospitals, and I always felt like a real fly on the wall looking at, and most doctors are super good people. They're really good-hearted. They want to help people heal. But, this is a situation where you hear this, but, specifically when people say about the medical, it's the system that's the problem. And, my point about the monetary system too is this gradient of conflict of interest where it's but we want to make more money. Yeah, but we're here to heal people. There has to be value in also having a healthy population. This conflict of interest has maybe, hopefully for now, reached a crest after all the shenanigans of COVID-19, where people will take a look and say, yeah, but we know better. We actually do know better. And unfortunately, and this is my position on all things medical, is that you do have to learn a level of patient advocacy. You have to be able to advocate for yourself. It's not good that it is this way, but the more you know about where you can say to your doctor, don't do that test. I want to know about this insulin test. Let's screen for this. These kinds of things really, really matter now. So I'll keep putting resources together for you. Thank you very much, my friend. Super good to catch up with you again.
Excellent.
Appreciate it. Yep. All the best, guys. Thanks. We'll be back.